Kevin, welcome, and over to you.
Great. Hear me okay?
I sure can.
Fantastic. All right. Welcome, everyone. My name's Kevin Holman. I'm a customer engineer at Microsoft, and I kind of I certainly didn't invent or create, but I pioneered the use of management pack fragments in helping customers write better management packs that are difficult through other tools. And we're going to continue that series of using fragments to write monitoring. And so today's session, I'm actually going to do something similar to what I've done in the past, where I'm going to take some real world customer issues. Most of the fragments that I write are questions that come from customers, and this, like, how can I do this? How can I do that? And I'll go look and realize, there's kind of a gap, and we really need to do something here. And so I continually add fragments to the fragment library. So, if you're already using fragments, this will be great for you, because you'll get to see some of the new ones that I've added very, very recently and how to leverage them. And if you're brand new to fragments, this will be fine too, because you'll get to see me walk through the beginnings of just using fragments to discover an application dynamically and start monitoring it. So with that, what we're going to cover today is process monitoring. I had a lot of customer requests on how to monitor a process, and I realized, we've got this great process monitoring template in SCOM. But for a customer that's using fragments, it doesn't really work well, because it doesn't allow them to target the process monitoring to a specific application that they've already written in their management pack. And so I wrote several process monitors. I kind of started discovering all kinds of issues with our process monitoring in general, and tried to make those better and easier to use. Same thing with port availability. We have a port monitoring template that will monitor the availability of a TCP port listener on a server. My customers were asking me, I just want to test it locally. I don't need to necessarily run it as a synthetic transaction. I just want to make sure, hey, I'm monitoring this service, I'm monitoring this process, but how do I know that it's actually listening on the port that it's supposed to? And so I've written a fragment for that. A very common request was, I need to run a SQL query synthetically. So I'm going to execute it on one system. And, that may be the system that actually contains a database, or it may be a remote system that contains a database. But it's very common for applications to read and write to a database. And so this will be an example of a fragment that makes that pretty easy to use, and then you can use that as the base to customize it if you need to do something different, like connect to Oracle or a different type of database other than Microsoft SQL Server. And then lastly, we're going to go through adding recoveries. So it's I've written several fragments over the years that have recoveries built into them, but I've never made it easy to just add a recovery to any monitor. And if you look at the SCOM UI, it's not very easy to add recoveries to monitors. Our UI, if you go to add them, you can basically run a command, or you can run a script, and the built-in script is VB script only still. So customers want to run PowerShell recoveries, and so I've instituted a fragment that should make that a lot simpler. So with that, let's get started with the process count monitoring. So my customer request was, I'm already using fragments. I want to add a process monitor to one of my existing management packs, and I need it to be highly configurable. I want to be able to supply a minimal amount of configuration information, but enough to make it super effective. So that would be the process name, how often I want it to run, what's the minimum number of processes I expect, what's the maximum. So I can use this to look for unwanted processes or wanted. And I can say, hey, there should be one and only one process running, or I could say there could be a range of anywhere between one process and 5 processes with that name. So we provide the minimax, and then the consecutive failures. So to limit noise in a management pack, I always try to add match count. And what that does is that says if you're going to check every 60 seconds for a variance to something like a service isn't running or a process doesn't exist, how long should I wait before generating the alert? Because if it's just a temporary issue, let's say that the service crashed and the process isn't present, but in 60 seconds, the service will restart and the process will be back. And if that's okay, I don't need to generate an alert on that condition. And so match count really helps limit noise. And you'll see a trend in management pack fragments where I try to make sure that we always add that. So let's do a demo. So I'm going to start by launching. Now, today I'm going to demo everything in MP Author Pro because the Pro version is what allows us to use fragments. You do not have to use MP Author Pro. You can use Visual Studio with the VSAE authoring extensions. And if you go to, I'll have some links at the end of this with to my blog, and it'll show how to do these same things with Visual Studio. It's a lot easier to do it with Select MP Author Pro. But the fragments work the same either way, so just be aware of that. So I am going to create a new management pack, and I'm just going to give it a company ID. So I'm just going to be like ABC Chemical Company, and let's just call this SCOM Health. So today, my application, I'm just going to use the SCOM service as the cornerstone of the application. You can use anything you want here. It's really going to be based on the app that you're trying to monitor. And I do recommend you create one management pack per application. So next, and we're just going to save it to that folder. That looks good. And we're going to pick, the minimum version I'm developing for. So if you're running SCOM 2012 R2, I hope you're not, but if you are, you can choose that or 2016 or 2019. I tend to choose my minimum version as 2016, so it'll work in either version. And I'm going to create an empty management pack. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to discover the application. And so I have a ton of fragments that make this easy. That's not the purpose of today's demo. So I'm going to run through these relatively quickly so we can get to the process monitoring, which is the point. So I'm just going to search, and I'm going to do a registry key exists to discover the app. I got my screen resolution a little low. There we go. And I'm going to browse. I'm actually going to change this one up. I had some ideas from the last time, so you're going to get to see this one happen live. So I'm just going to pick a reg key, and I'm going to use Microsoft Operations Manager. Oh, I've got to pick a different system. I hope this works. I haven't done this in a long time. Because my local machine doesn't have the reg key that I'm looking for. So Microsoft Operations Manager, Server Management Group. So I'm just going to try to discover if you're a management server or a gateway for this class. All right, and so I'll just call this my SCOM server for my unique ID. And what you can see is happening, you actually get to see the XML, the instructions for how to use the fragment, how old, when it was updated, and it's finding and replacing and building your class, your discovery, all the display strings that are necessary. It's building that on the fly. So I'm going to hit import. All right, and save it. There's our class. Now, I also want to, let me do a search here and bring in a folder. So this will just be my, ABC SCOM Health. That looks good. And I'll import that folder. And I want some views as well. So I'll come in here. And let's add a state view and an alert view. So you can kind of get the idea. This is super fast. I mean, I've brought in a dynamic discovery. I've defined a class of my SCOM servers. I've created a folder that's going to show up in the console and created an alert view and a state view that are focused on, oop, that is the wrong class. I'm glad I caught that. Let me pick, it's the SCOM server class this time. There we go. And unique ID, there we go. That looks good. And I'll import. That probably would have thrown an error when I hit import anyway. So let's save that and I'll go ahead and deploy it now to my SCOM management group. All right. And we'll get that deploying. And down here in the lower left-hand corner, you can kind of see Silect is telling us it's deploying that management pack. And that way, that will get those discoveries kicked off and it'll populate that class with all the servers that I want to actually run all the monitoring that I'm going to add in. And that's usually pretty quick. I'll kick over to my SCOM console and I'll go to administration. And there it is. I can see that it's imported my SCOM health management pack. Great. So we can continue. Oh, by the way, I'll just go ahead and show this real quick. We did create a folder. So I'm going to refresh this and here's a folder and I've got my SCOM server state view and my SCOM server alert view. There's everything that we created so far. It hasn't populated yet because it's going through the discovery process now. So that should be populated in just a little bit. So continuing on, we're going to now start the process monitoring. So I'm going to browse to where I have my fragments. And I'm going to bring in one called monitor process. So I'm going to choose that. And here's what I have to provide. Okay, my company ID, my app name all stay the same. My unique ID for this is actually going to be a process. So I'm going to call this monitoring host process. I'm targeting my SCOM server class. I want to use process name. So this is the lowercase of the name, such as. So this actually should be monitoring host.exe. So I'm just following the instructions for each one of these. I'm going to check every 60 seconds. And then I expect there to be at least 2 monitoring host processes. I'll just say you need at least 1. And the maximum should be 2. All right. And normally I would put a match count here to prevent noise for a temporary condition, but just I want these to update quickly for the demo. So I'm just going to go ahead and set match count to 1. And that's it. That's all the information I had to provide is the basics around my MP, the class that I want to target it to, and the process name and the basics of it. So it's very similar to the process wizard. It's just all on one screen. It's actually a lot faster, especially if you have a lot of processes to monitor. So I'm going to go ahead and import this one. And we will save it. And deploy it. And so I'll kick over to my SCOM environment, and what we can see is I am starting to discover my management servers here. So they're not monitored right now because I don't have any monitors deployed, and I should see the other ones deploy quickly. Okay, that got deployed. And let me do a refresh. Yep, they're starting to discover, and I'll run a Health Explorer against this, and you'll actually see that monitor. It just hasn't initialized yet, but here's my monitoring host process count monitor. So we'll check back on this one. We'll give it a couple minutes to initialize and for all the servers to finish their discovery. And we should be able to see this process monitoring output good or bad and start to generate alerts. Yep, there we go. I've got them all. There's 3 management servers and a gateway. And here, these are starting to initialize. And there you go. It's just initialized. So within 60 seconds, I should see some of these start to actually alarm once they've initialized, because the management servers will often have more than one monitoring host.exe process. So with that, let me check on this one. There we go. Here's a perfect example, so we don't have to wait. So if I look at the process, I can go down to monitoring host and I can see there are actually 3 processes running. I'm using the native modules for that come with SCOM for process monitoring. And so that's going to say that's bad because we set the max process count to 2. And that's going to generate the threshold. And I also should see some alerts get generated. So if I look, here we go. And it's the number of processes was less or greater than the threshold, monitoring host, how many we found, and then the server. So that works perfectly, just as we'd expect. So another type of process monitoring that my customer asked me for, they said, well, what do I do if I have like in this case, they had an Oracle application that had a ton of processes that all started with ORA, but they didn't really want to create individual process monitors for each and every one. They just knew that for this to be healthy, they had to have at least 5 of those processes running. So in a case like that, I actually wrote another process monitoring fragment, and it's this wildcard. And so if we look at the instructions here, it says this is a monitor for process count monitoring that accepts wildcards for multiple process names. So I'll show you how it works. If we look at a typical server or client machine in Task Manager, and I'm just going to use the RDP services. There's 2 services here, one called RDP clip and the other one is RDP input. And I can use a wildcard to say, hey, anything that starts with RDP, I want there to be 2 processes. So I'm just going to click through these, my SCOM server class, and this is going to be RDP process for my unique ID. And for my wildcard, I'm actually going to use RDP star. So any process that starts with RDP will be included. And my min process count, I'm going to say is 2. And my max process count is 2. And that's it. So that's all that I've got as far as configuration. So I will go ahead and do that. Now, I remember from playing with this earlier, I think I hard coded the time, the frequency. So I probably need to go change that and make that a parameter, but I'm just going to change this from running 1 hour to every 60 seconds. So I can do that right in the Select tool. And I'll save that. And then we'll go ahead and deploy it. All right, and that's deploying. And so it will be very similar. That will show healthy. I'll show you the output in a little bit once these initialize. So yeah, so I jumped a little bit ahead, but this was the customer request for wildcards. They wanted to monitor processes that matched a naming wildcard, and we need to be configurable. Give me the process name, give me the frequency, the min, and the max. The frequency I obviously didn't add in the fragment, so that's something that I need to go back and update. So the next request was, what about process performance? And so I actually have a blog article on this, but that got written because I learned some really cool features about multi-instance process monitoring in SCOM. It's actually a little tricky. And so when you monitor process performance counters, if the process only has a single instance of the process running, it's really easy. You can just use any old perfmon counter using the SCOM UI. But if you wanted to, if the process had multiple instances, it's actually the built-in performance monitoring monitor doesn't work, and it'll actually flip-flop on you. And so they said we need something that works. We just want to give the perf counter name, the process name, the frequency, whatever the threshold we want, and then to have the match count, which is that consecutive samples over threshold. So let's go take a look at how we would make that. So by the way, I'm just going to check on these real quick and refresh. And so I'll look at my gateway for an example here. Oh, that RDP process one hasn't initialized yet. Let me see if it's initialized on a management server. Yeah, there we go. So here's that RDC, the RDP process, and we can see that it's healthy. And here's the monitor output. It shows that, yep, we found 2 processes. The min was 2 and the max was 2. So this is a healthy condition and it's in a healthy state. So that one worked great. That's the PowerShell script-based monitor that we just brought in. Okay, on process performance, I'm going to kick back over to MP Author. I'm going to import a fragment and browse. And here I have a special fragment dedicated for process performance monitoring. And it's just a 2-state monitor. So we're going to pick that one. And ABC, SCOM Health, our SCOM server class. This is going to be memory. The counter name, we'll use private byte. So maybe we think there's a memory leak in SCOM on the management server for some process, or this could be related to your application. So I can just use the private bytes counter, and the process name is exactly as it shows in perfmon. So I need to go check that. So in perfmon, I'm going to go find the process object. There it is. And I want private bytes because that's how we measure the memory of a process, and then go find our monitoring host. There it is. And so I need to do it. I need to spell it case sensitive, everything exactly like you see that. So I'll kick back over. I'll get rid of this and it will be monitoring host, just like I see it in perfmon. And then I'll say, okay, the frequency, check every 60 seconds. That's 500 megabytes as the threshold. I'll just go ahead and leave that for the purposes of the demo. Yours would probably be higher or lower. And I'll set my sample count to 1 just to speed up the demo. But again, to cut out transient noise issues, I might set this to 5 samples so it wouldn't alarm until 5 minutes had passed. And so I'll go ahead and hit import. And I get this pop-up and it says, oh, you're missing references to the process monitoring library. Well, one of the nice things about using Select is you don't have to create your references. It just does it for you. So you just hit yes, and it will bring those in. All right, and there is our process performance. So I will save that. And we'll go ahead and deploy that one. And go. All right, while that's deploying, we'll move on to the next one. So the customer request for this one was, I want to monitor port availability. And if you look at the built-in template, it's kind of a pain because it's not application specific. So I have to pick a group of machines to run the port availability monitor on. It requires that I set up watcher nodes to do it synthetically. So that's great if that's the way you want to check ports, but for for the purposes of monitoring port availability in an application, it makes more sense to have a fragment. So I wrote one for that. And this is where we'll monitor TCP port availability for the app. So I talked about why we wouldn't use the template, and we always want to use native modules where possible. And when I say native modules, SCOM already has native modules to read a service status, the event log, process monitoring, port availability. There's a bunch of native modules that are built into SCOM. They're incredibly efficient. So I only drop down to script if I feel like I have to. That being said, SCOM runs scripts incredibly efficiently, and they run really, really quickly. So that's not a huge concern of mine, especially for PowerShell. Because we have a PowerShell native module built into the SCOM agent. But I still, if there's a native module and I can use it, I always try to. So really all that we need to configure is the port number that we want to monitor. So let's take a look at that. So I'm going to bring in a fragment and I'm going to browse, and this is monitor port check. So in my monitor port check fragment, I have to provide my company ID. You know, these are pre-populated if you've reused it, but really I'm just telling it, you know, what class do you want to target? What port number do you want to check? So in this case, this is SCOM. So I'm going to check 5723 because all my management servers and gateways should be listening on port 5723. And then I'll just call this the port listener for my unique ID, and that built all the XML. It just brought all of this in from the fragment. It only asked me a couple questions. You can see it just builds a ton of stuff. So I'll go ahead and say import. It tells me I need a reference. I'll go ahead and say, yeah, please go ahead and add it. And there we go. It was easy as that. All I really had to provide was the port number. And now all my applications that are dynamically discovered will automatically start monitoring for that port. So I'll save that and deploy it and get that underway. And while that's deploying, I'm going to go check. I'm building a lot of yellow out here, which is great. But I want to go check that private bytes monitor that we just created, the process performance. And what we can see is this one is triggered. And sure enough, the threshold is breached. And we can see that it's 830 megs. And we set our threshold at 500 megs. So that's exactly what we would expect to see. So that's great. And that deployed. And I'll just go ahead and show that real quick. I'm going to open up Health Explorer. And here is our port check monitor. Now it's not initialized because we just imported it. So we just got to wait a couple minutes and this will start checking for port availability, and we'll see the state change event and all the good information. So we'll check back with that in a minute. Okay, monitor a SQL query. This was another common customer request. I've had a lot of customers use the fragment for this and provide feedback. So I've probably updated the SQL monitoring fragment 10 times based on customer feedback. But basically, we're just going to monitor a SQL query for expected output. So it needs to be configurable. So I can supply the SQL server, the database name, the query I want to run, the frequency. And in this case, this particular example, I just used a row count threshold to say, you know, run this query. And if the output fails, like I can't even connect, it's going to tell me it's bad. Or if it doesn't return any rows, it's going to tell me it's bad. But otherwise, I'm looking for a threshold. So for this example, I'm just going to use I'm going to query the SCOM database and throw an alert if there are too many alerts generated in SCOM, because that's an easy SQL query based one that we can do. So again, I'm going to come here to import fragment. I'm going to browse, and I need to find my monitor TimeScript PowerShell SQL query. There it is. And so this uses PowerShell to actually execute the query. I'll bring that in. So ABC, SCOM Health, my server class. I'm just going to call this SQL Query Alerts. Oops. Let's see. Normally I wouldn't run a SQL query every 60 seconds, but for the purpose of the demo, that's fine. I need to provide my SQL server name and my instance name. Here's my database name, and here's the query I'm going to run. So I'm just going to do a select count star from alert and say if there's greater than 50 alerts, that's bad, right? And that's it. So that's all I had to provide for my SQL query monitor. It's really, really easy. There's tons of XML here that get created. There's a data source, a PowerShell script. There's monitor types and monitors that are all built into this. So you don't have to know how to do any of that. Just supply the simple information at the top, hit import, and we're away. So I'll save that and deploy it. All right, and while that's deploying, we're going to come back and look at that port listener port check monitor, and we're going to see that we have output. And so we can see up the port is responding. The port was 5723, and the connection time was incredibly fast, right? So that it responded immediately, and it didn't throw a negative status code, so we're good. And so that's exactly what we're looking for. We want to make sure our SCOM server is always listening on 5723, and here's a simple transaction to do that. And I'll be able to see that new monitor for SQL Query. And again, it just hasn't initialized. It's going to take a minute or two, and it will start running that SQL Query. So we'll come back and check on that. All right, and let me see. Yeah, we want that process count monitor. All right. So the last one that we wanted to demo was how to add recoveries to any monitor. So the customer request was, Kevin, I've got all these monitors I've written, and now the customer is asking me to add recoveries. Maybe it was a service monitor. They didn't want a recovery in the beginning, and so we didn't add one. And now I need to go back and add in a recovery for the service. Or maybe I'm monitoring a process, and if the process count is wrong or it doesn't exist, I want to recycle a service, or even reboot a computer. I've definitely written recoveries that do that kind of stuff. Maybe I'm monitoring free disk space, and now I'm ready to go ahead and automate a recovery to try to clean up the C drive automatically and fix the problem on demand. So we can add a recovery to any monitor. It's really easy in the UI to add these recoveries if you're just running a simple command or VB script. And with some of the add-ons that are out there, there's even ways to add recoveries to PowerShell. But if a customer's already using Fragments, you're going to want to use Fragments for everything. You're not going to want to dip back into the console and make some really ugly XML when you could do it in a Fragment. So we'll demo that. This will execute a PowerShell script, and the only thing you have to do is go tweak the script to actually do what you want it to do. This particular recovery doesn't do anything. It just logs an event in the event log that the recovery ran, and we'll actually see that in the output of the monitor. So with that, let's go ahead and demo it. So, I'm going to check real quick and see if the SQL, yeah, it has run. So here's our SQL query alert. And so it says it's unhealthy. The SQL returned 85 alerts. And remember, we set our threshold at 50. So there are 85 rows returned from the query. That's bad because our threshold was 50, 85 is above 50. That's it. But you can see the example here where it completed successfully. I'll show you, I think on my gateway, it will actually fail for a different reason. And I want you to see that. And it literally says, the SQL returned 0, But here's the problem. It failed to connect to SQL Server because login failed to the database. And that's simply because the gateway server doesn't have rights to connect to the SQL Server, and so this is failing. You could fix this with run as, or maybe you could disable it for your gateways, but this will just show you an example. You know, you always want to make sure when you write a monitor that you account for something going bad. If there's an exception in the PowerShell script, you want that captured and output bad behavior. So we drive the monitor bad so you know that it's actually not even working. The worst case scenario is we have these monitors that initialize, they fail, but since they don't output, you know, a number of that's greater than 50 on the threshold, they just stay in a healthy state, and that's terrible. So you always want to make sure that if your script has a problem completing, you capture that and you output a bad condition. Okay, back to creating the monitor or the recovery. Sorry, I'm going to import fragment, and I'm going to browse, and I'm going to scroll down to my recovery scripts. And I have two here that I've added. There's a simple and there's an advanced. So the simple just says this monitor is unhealthy. I'm going to run this script. That's it. The advanced recovery is a little more advanced for customers who want to take data from the monitor and pass that to the recovery. And where that's useful is if you had a service monitor. One of the outputs in a service monitor is the service name. So you could actually pass the service name to a generic service recovery script. And that way you never have to hard code the service name in each and every individual recovery. You could use a standard generic recovery script that accepts the service name as a parameter to the script. And so the advanced one shows you how to do that. For the purposes of today, I'm just going to do the simple one. And ABC, SCOM Health, I'm targeting my SCOM server class. And you do have to know the monitor ID of the monitor you want to use. So you can get that from Select. Let me just show what that looks like. So if I came over here to monitors, let me make sure I got a refresh. And I look at, okay, I want to do the process count monitor. And right here, I can go grab that. This is the ID of the process count monitor. And now when I import my fragment, I can paste in the correct monitor ID that I want to attach this to. So you would have to look that up in advance. You'd kind of have to know what that is. You know, maybe in a future version of Select, they could add a browse that would let you browse monitors and other management packs. You know, I'm just kind of thinking out loud, but it's really not that hard to find the monitor ID that you want to attach it to. Usually it's in the management pack you're working with. And then execute on state, that could be warning or error. And I explain all of that in the instructions, right? With examples of exactly how you would want this to look or what you want to do for it. And we'll call this proc count recovery for our unique ID. And that created all the XML that we need for the recovery script. And you can see this particular recovery script, it doesn't do anything. It just does a simple log event that the script is starting, and then it does another log event that the script is completed, you know, with the runtime that the script took. So I'm going to go ahead and import this. That's it. I mean, it was super simple to add that recovery. Now, again, this recovery does nothing. You need to supply your own PowerShell script. I have lots of examples of PowerShell script recoveries that are in some of the other fragments. So you can look at those and use them as a base template if you're kind of new to PowerShell. So with that, I will save it and deploy our recovery. And what was the last one that we wrote? Oh, I think it was the SQL query, and that one's already done. So let me see. Yeah, SQL query. So we already tested the SQL query, so that's good. So we'll just wait for this recovery, adding the recovery to a monitor to work, and we'll actually get to see that happen in real time. Okay, it says that deployed successfully. So I'm going to kick back over to my SCOM console. Let me close this Health Explorer, do a refresh, open this up. And now if I look, oh, I did forget something and I'll show you. It's not going to work by default. So this was the process count monitor. And if I look at the properties of that and I go to diagnostics and recoveries, you can see there is our recovery that we just added. But here's the issue. I forgot. I never turn run automatically on by default on a recovery because I want to be very careful with recovery actions in general. So when I write these, I always set the recovery to be disabled by default. You have to turn that on. So you can do that in Select before you deploy, or we can do it right here. So I'm just going to say edit, and we're going to check this box that says run recovery automatically. So there we go. And hit OK. Now we'll have to wait for that recovery action to get, downloaded to all the servers that are actually going to run this recovery so we can see it work. Okay, that's saved. I'm going to go check my management server event log. And it hasn't downloaded that messaging yet. So we'll see if we can time this just right. I'm going to force reset the process count monitor that has the recovery. And hopefully with the timing, it'll catch it just right and we won't have to wait very long during the demo. Okay, so that's now healthy. If we look at my state change events, I can see, yep, my process count was bad for monitoring host because there are 4 monitoring hosts running. My max is 2. That's why this monitor went unhealthy. And here it is. I forced it to reset state. So it downloaded my new management pack and it enforced it. So so that should be good. And here's my recovery running. So let me show you what that looks like in SCOM. So I'm going to refresh and we can see in my state change events, it went back to unhealthy, but this time when I scroll to the bottom, I'll actually be able to see that there was a recovery that ran successfully, and here's the output from the script. Anything you put in a write host will dump to the SCOM console here. So the only thing I put in there in this particular PowerShell script is a log that the script is starting and then a log that it completed, and we can actually see that right there in the console. So if there was service restarts, all you have to do is add anything you want to see and track the progress in the SCOM console. Just put it in a write host in your PowerShell script and it will dump that to this screen. So that's a success. All right. So let's do a recap of what did we do here today. We created an application MP. We dynamically discovered the application, in this case based on a reg key, but you can use, I have so many different fragments for classes and discoveries, and I'm always writing new ones. We added a folder and we added some state and alert views to track our progress. We did a monitor for the process count. We actually did 2. One was a wildcard that runs PowerShell. The other one was a native module process count monitor. We monitored the process performance We checked on the port availability to make sure that the application was listening on the TCP port we expect. And we executed a SQL query from the front end server of the application to the back end database, wherever that may be. And that worked really, really well. It's just a simple PowerShell script that does it. And then we added a recovery to automatically take an action. And you can, again, use that same fragment for any number of monitors and add things really, really quickly. So these types of things would take hours minimum, if not days, to write using the myriad of other tools that are out there like VSAE, or they require a lot of advanced XML manual edits to customize them the way you want. But you can see in 45 minutes, going slow, waiting for them to update, we were able to add a lot of monitoring for an application that's fairly advanced. This is not basic service and event log type stuff. Those are really easy to do. A lot of this stuff is fairly advanced. And with these fragments, you can see the power of writing a lot of complex stuff really, really quickly. So what's available now as far as fragments go? I can't remember when we launched fragments the very first time. I think we had 25 of them. And so this is obviously grown. It's been based off of your feedback to me through my blog, or also just from the community commenting, or my customers asking me for new stuff. And I'm like, oh, that's something that I think everyone could use. And so I'll add those. And when I say greater than 108, 108 is the fragments I've written. There are other people in the community that write and share fragments, and these are all published directly in Silex tool, or you can download them independently. So here are the resources that are available. There's a link to my GitHub, which is where the fragment library is published. So you can go download these independently if you want. If you want to use Visual Studio, because you don't use Silex, you can download the Visual Studio authoring extensions. I have a step-by-step on how to use Visual Studio. And so like when I kick this off, this is like an 8-part series. So if you're new to fragments, there's only 8 parts to it, and it takes about 2 hours to go through all of them start to finish. So if you're new to fragments and you're not really sure about stepping out, I definitely recommend spend the 2 hours, play with it. Everybody I know that starts using fragments, they convert really, really quickly because they see the power, the benefits of really taking SCOM to where it could be, as opposed to just using the built-in management packs and the third-party management packs. And then you saw me demo today Silex MP Author Pro, which makes it just so much faster and so much easier to use. So I definitely recommend using Silex if you're going to heavily use fragments, because it's just a huge time saver from that aspect. And with that, I think I will take questions. So give me a minute to get in there. I'm assuming that we have some questions on this.
We do indeed, Kevin. We have
Okay.
a bunch of questions waiting for you.
Let's see.
I think Mike has taken a try at 1 or 2 of them, but we'll leave the others to you.
Okay, great. Why don't I just bring this over here? I don't think I'm going to share anything that I shouldn't. Teams, Watcher. Were there any improvements in SCOM sensitivity and network? No, that's M360. Okay, do you have fragments which runs PowerShell based on run at a certain time of day? I do have fragments that run once a day, and then you can add sync time so that they would run at a specific time. If you want like business hour fragments, that's just modifying the scheduler, where you put in like, I only want it to run after 5 p.m. on Saturdays, like that. SCOM has the capability for that. You could use any of the PowerShell fragments that use the scheduler because they all use it, and then you would just go tweak that one thing. Right. So fragments, I wouldn't write a separate fragment for that. I expect you to take other example fragments and tweak them to do very customized things that you want to do yourself. Is match count in your service monitoring fragments? Absolutely. I would not have a certain, yeah, but this is one of the things that stinks about the built-in service monitor in SCOM is the match count is hard coded to 2 and you can't adjust that. So I definitely put that in all my service monitoring fragments. Can we not use MP Fragments in MP Studio? Only in MP, MP Studio includes MP Author Pro, so you can definitely do that. Oh yeah, Mike's already got that, sorry. Does VS Code? It doesn't, And we've asked that, lots of people have asked that. Everyone loves VS Code. Microsoft just shipped a version of VS Code on the web now that you can just go use in seconds. It would be awesome if VS Code supported these MP extensions. And I heard Akash talk this morning about some advancements in MP authoring and trying to make that easier. So I am super excited to hear where they're looking to take it, because it would be great if VS Code had native support for Visual Studio authoring. Visual Studio is kind of a limiter. Not everyone has access to that or a license to that. I think we've done demos in the past where you can actually use the free version, but the free version has some license limitations for corporate customers. So I hate to see that be a blocker. Obviously, if you're really going to invest in fragments, I recommend using Select, but I'm excited if we can make VS Code work as well. How can a recovery action be triggered from the management server instead of target agents? I actually have a blog post on that, where you can run a response on a management server as opposed to the agent. It's not technically a recovery action, but I think it could be written in the context of a recovery action. So check out that blog post on how to run a response on a management server. When you create state views or alert views, are there any specific precautions to ensure they work in both the FAT client and web console? The web, no, I don't think there's any recommendations as far as that. They should work either way. A lot of the web console stuff, you're kind of going to want to start developing in the web console, especially the dashboards, because those things are features that only work in the HTML5 console of 2019 and later. Let's see, any recommendation on naming nomenclature if there are differences? No, I can't imagine having, I'm real big on coming up with a standard. So like if you're going to have like a web only view, it's only going to show up in the web. So I don't even know if you need naming differences unless you're going to have multiple views. And in that case, you may just want to come up with some standard where you always add, web in the name or something like that. Can we monitor a specific process thread, multiple PIDs? Can we monitor a specific process thread? I'm not sure I really understand, but if you have multiple PIDs, you have multiple instances of the process, and I demoed how you would do that today. So if I understood that right, great. If I didn't, go ahead and rephrase the question. Is the process monitoring fragment, is there a way to use regular expressions instead of wildcards? There's no reason why you couldn't. Wildcard was a simple way to accomplish my customer task. But you could totally pass in a regex. All you're doing is you're passing that as a parameter to PowerShell. So if you look at my PowerShell, it's super simple. You should be able to pass in a regex statement into the PowerShell. You may have to, there's something called a CData tag. If you guys remember those from the VB script days, you may have to encapsulate it in a CData tag because it may have XML. There are things allowed in regex that will break XML. Just like there were standard modifiers in VB script that broke XML, and that's why you had to encapsulate your scripts in CData tags. Will we get the links emailed to us? Yeah, I would like to set up a recovery that restarts multiple services in response to a single alert. Is there a fragment that helps us set up the service restarts considering service dependencies? No, using a fragment is not going to help anybody understand your app or your custom stuff. You write all that into PowerShell, and then you can simply use my service recovery or my PowerShell script recovery fragment, and then you just put in the script what you want it to do. So if you have service dependencies, you would write that into the script, that process. If you go look at my service monitoring recovery, that's in one of my service monitoring fragments, it has lots of logic where it, attempts a restart, it waits to see if it's running, it does all these things. So that you can, it's whatever, you're only limited by what you can put in PowerShell, which is almost limitless. So are there fragments for web monitors, or would you use PowerShell? This is a common ask, Paul, for web monitoring. I haven't written anything for URL monitoring because there's so many great tools out there like URL Genie, and like the built-in templates are really powerful for web monitoring. If I wanted to do something very simple, I would probably use a PowerShell invoke web request and then just measure the output. Or I could even use a native module. And so I've thought about writing some fragments for web because this comes up on almost every Select MPU. I haven't had a good customer use case that helped me write it. So if there are examples, hit me up on the blog and give me some ideas there. Is there a fragment for network time drift? There's not a fragment, but I have a management pack for time drift that has that. And there is also time drift built into the Windows Server 2016 and later agnostic management pack. So I wrote one specific that gave you power to say who you want to compare as your time server source. But there is time drift built into Windows Server 2016 and later OSMP. Kevin, you're my hero. I want to build a SCOM MP to control power stations. Would you help me build this? You can hit me up, Bob, on my blog, and just kind of give me some ideas of what you want to do, and we can chat about it. I don't have anything offhand that I know about monitoring hydroelectric power stations, but anything that can be monitored using PowerShell or using native modules, you can write that and build that into SCOM for sure. All right, I think that was the last question.
I believe so, Kevin. I think that's the last one that I saw anyway. So, your timing is perfect as usual. Kevin, thank you so much for your contribution to today's MP University. Extremely valuable. Great to see how fragments continue to evolve and continue to really help the community, ultimately get more value from their SCOM infrastructure. Okay, so let's just go ahead and go back to our agenda, and we can wrap things up. I do want to share a couple of the links, and so a few things. First of all, the recordings and any relevant material, including these links, will be emailed out to everybody who is registered for the event. I know some folks couldn't attend, but they will get links to all of the recordings of the sessions. The first three links mentioned here, Akash wanted me to share those with everyone. Relate to some feedback on SCOM Ignite event. Looks like Microsoft's got some pretty cool stuff lined up to announce it at Ignite next week. So looks like a real good use of time. There's a preview of SCOM 2022 sign up. Kevin, I've just referred your blog here, and I think if there's anything else that Kevin or any of the other presenters want to share, that will come in the follow-up email. That's going to go to everybody. And so I want to thank you all for attending today's MP University. Again, really important that you complete our survey. That's really the only thing we ask as we want to make sure that these events are relevant and are important, and you really get what you need out of the event. We value your time. And so I think with that, I will once again thank Microsoft, both Akash and Kevin, for their contribution, Bob from TopCore, Mike from Silect. And again, thank you all for attending today's event. And with that, we are going to wrap things up.